My son lay unresponsive for 2 years, a prisoner of a tragic accident. But the day I walked in on our maid whispering to him, I learned the truth. It was no accident at all. The jet engines of the Gulf Stream whined down as we touched the tarmac in Westchester, a full day ahead of schedule. The Tokyo deal, the one that was supposed to take a week of brutal negotiations, had imploded in a spectacular fashion on day 2. A junior analyst on their side had found a fatal flaw in the valuation, and just like that, a multi-billion-dollar merger evaporated into thin air. I should have been furious, incandescent with rage, but as the private car whisked me through the gates of my estate, all I felt was a hollow, familiar exhaustion. My empire was built on a foundation of sleepless nights and missed moments, and this was just another crack in the facade. My home isn't a home. It's a monument to success, a sprawling minimalist structure of glass and steel that overlooks 100 acres of manicured emptiness. It had been my late wife Eleanor's dream, but without her laughter echoing in the cavernous halls, it felt more like a mausoleum. I walked in through the grand entrance, the click of my Italian leather shoes the only sound in the oppressive silence. The staff knew my schedule to the minute. They weren't expecting me. The house was still, caught in its midday slumber. I loosened my tie, the knot feeling like a noose around my neck, and headed for the west wing, towards Leo's room. My son, my Leo. Before the accident, he was a blaze of life. Soccer captain, straight-A student, with his mother's bright eyes and a smile that could disarm armies. Then came that rainy night on the interstate. A drunk driver blew through a red light, and in the space of a single, screeching heartbeat, my world was fractured. I lost Elena forever, and I lost the son I knew. The doctors were clinical, their words like sterile instruments. Severe spinal cord injury, quadriplegia, minimal chance of significant recovery. He was paralyzed from the chest down, his vibrant voice silenced by the trauma. For 2 years he had been a prisoner in his own body, his world shrunk to the confines of a state-of-the-art medical bed, and the view of an unchanging oak tree outside his window. Every day was the same. A team of nurses handled his physical needs, and a stoic, middle-aged woman named Maria handled the house. She'd been with us for a few years, even before the accident. She was quiet, efficient, almost invisible. She cleaned, she cooked when required, she managed the other staff. I barely registered her presence, another cog in the machine that kept my gilded cage running. I paid her an obscene salary to ensure my son's environment was spotless, and that she never, ever bothered me. As I neared Leo's wing, I braced myself for the familiar wave of guilt and grief. I prepared for the sight of him lying motionless, his beautiful face a placid mask, his eyes fixed on some distant point on the ceiling that only he could see. But as I approached his door, which was usually kept shut to maintain a sterile environment, I noticed it was slightly ajar, and I heard something. It wasn't the rhythmic beep of the monitors or the gentle hum of the air purifier. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, speaking in a low, gentle cadence. It was Spanish, a language I only vaguely understood, but the tone was unmistakable. It was warm, intimate, like a mother cooing to a child. My first thought was a flash of irritation. Who was in there? Was it one of the younger nurses breaking protocol, on her phone perhaps? I crept closer, my footsteps silenced by the plush runner. I peered through the narrow gap in the doorway, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the room. And then I saw them. My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it was ripped from my chest. It was Maria, our maid. She was sitting on a small stool pulled right up beside Leo's bed, a position the nurses rarely took unless they were performing a procedure. She wasn't cleaning. She wasn't tidying. She was holding Leo's hand, not his limp, lifeless hand resting on the sheets, but she had gently lifted it and was cradling it in both of her own. Her head was bowed slightly as she spoke, her voice a soothing river of Spanish words. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a halo around her simple, grey-streaked bun. This was strange enough, a breach of the professional distance I expected and paid for. But that wasn't what made the world tilt on its axis. That wasn't what made the air in my lungs turn to ice. It was Leo. His eyes weren't fixed on the ceiling. They were fixed on her, and in them I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen since before the crash. Focus. Awareness. But even that wasn't it. My gaze dropped to their joined hands. As Maria murmured another soft phrase, I saw it. A tremor. A twitch. Leo's index finger, the one the specialists had assured me would never receive a signal from his brain again, was slowly, deliberately, tracing a small shaky circle on the back of Maria's hand. I remained frozen in the hallway, a statue carved from disbelief. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, was short-circuiting. It had to be an involuntary muscle spasm, a phantom nerve firing. I had read dozens of medical journals, consulted with neurologists from 3 continents. They all concurred. The connection between Leo's brain and his limbs was severed, irreparably. The movement I saw was impossible, a trick of the light, a desperate hallucination born from a father's grief. I blinked, expecting the scene to reset, for Maria to be dusting a table, and for Leo's hand to be lying inert once more. But it happened again. Slower this time, more deliberate. The finger moved, a tiny, determined sweep across the back of her weathered hand. And Maria... She didn't react with surprise. She smiled. A small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. She squeezed his hand gently and whispered, "Poco a poco, mi leoncito." Little by little, my little lion. It was a conversation. They were having a conversation, and his only word was the touch of a single finger. I felt a dizzying rush of vertigo, as if the very foundations of my meticulously constructed world were crumbling into dust. For 2 years I had mourned a son who was, for all intents and purposes, gone. I had visited his room like one visits a grave, speaking at him, not to him. My words empty condolences offered to a memory. But this woman, this maid I barely knew the last name of, she was speaking with him. I backed away from the door, my movements clumsy and loud in the silent hall. I couldn't burst in there. To interrupt this fragile miracle, felt like sacrilege. What would I even say? Accuse her of what? Of giving my son hope, of achieving what my millions of dollars could not. The shame was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I retreated to my office, the one room in the house that was truly mine, a sanctuary of leather, mahogany, and market data. I sank into my chair, the one that had held me through countless all-night conference calls that sealed billion-dollar deals, and felt utterly powerless. My instincts, honed by decades in the corporate battlefield, took over. I needed information. I needed to understand what was happening under my own roof. I pulled up the security system on my desktop monitor, a network of dozens of cameras covering every inch of the estate. I found the one in the hallway outside Leo's room. The angle was poor, but it was enough. I rewound the footage. An hour ago. 2 hours. There she was, entering his room with a feather duster, closing the door almost fully behind her. I kept rewinding. Yesterday, the day before, the same routine. Every single day, like clockwork, during the nurse's 2-hour lunch shift, Maria would slip into his room. My fingers trembled as I switched to the archives. A week ago, a month, 2 months. The video was grainy, but the story it told was devastatingly clear. At first, she just sat with him, reading from a Spanish novel. Then she started holding his hand. Weeks passed on the screen in minutes. I watched as she massaged his fingers, his palms, talking to him the entire time. Then I saw it, the first flicker of movement from 3 weeks ago. A tiny, almost imperceptible twitch. She had gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't told me. A hot surge of anger mixed with the cold dread in my stomach. Who was this woman to keep this from me? But the anger was quickly extinguished by the evidence before my eyes. I watched the twitch grow into a press, the press into a shaky, faltering stroke. She was rehabilitating him in secret, with nothing more than patience and quiet conversation. She had unlocked a part of my son that the world's best doctors had written off. The question wasn't just how, but why. Why the secrecy? Was she afraid I wouldn't believe her? Or was there something else? Something more she was hiding? The video feed had no audio. That was the missing piece. I needed to know what she was saying to him. My security system was military grade, designed for a man with enemies. It had capabilities I rarely used. With a few clicks, I activated the discreet microphone in the ceiling of Leo's room, scheduling it to record the next day during her visit. The act felt like a vile betrayal of the sacred space she had created, but I had to know. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I went through the motions, dismissing the staff early, taking calls I don't remember, staring at stock tickers that meant nothing. Finally, the time came. I sat in my office, the door locked, a pair of studio-quality headphones over my ears. I watched on the monitor as Maria entered the room, and I clicked, "Listen live." Her voice filled my ears, the soft, lyrical Spanish I'd heard through the door. For 15 minutes she spoke of simple things, the color of the sky, a bird she'd seen in the garden. She held his hand. I saw his finger respond on the screen. Then her tone changed. The gentle cadence disappeared, replaced by a low, urgent whisper. She leaned in close to his ear, so close her lips almost brushed his temple, and she switched to perfect, unaccented English. "They're all fools, Leo," she whispered, her voice a raw, intense hiss that sent a chill down my spine. "The doctors, the nurses, your father. They look at you and see a broken boy. But I know you're in there. I know you remember everything." She paused, and I held my breath. "You remember what really happened that night, don't you? You remember it wasn't just an accident." The words hit me like a physical force, knocking the breath from my chest. It wasn't just an accident. The phrase echoed in the cavern of my skull, colliding with 2 years of established facts, police reports, and insurance settlements. The drunk driver, a young man named Kevin Hayes, had been found at the scene, his blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. It was an open and shut case of vehicular manslaughter and reckless endangerment. A tragedy, yes, but a simple one, or so I had believed. I leaned closer to the monitor, my knuckles white as I gripped the edge of the desk. My world, which had already been fractured, was now being pulverized. On the screen, Leo's hand was perfectly still. His finger, which had been so responsive just moments before, lay inert against Maria's skin. But his eyes were locked on her face, and for the first time I saw an unmistakable emotion in them. It wasn't awareness. It was fear. "He thinks his money can protect him," Maria continued, her voice dropping even lower, a venomous current running beneath the surface. "He thinks he can buy silence, buy loyalty. But he can't buy back your mother, can he? He can't fix what he allowed to happen." My mind reeled. He? Who was she talking about? Was she talking about me? Did she somehow blame me for the crash? The accusation was insane, but the conviction in her voice was terrifying. She stroked his hair, a gesture that now seemed menacing rather than comforting. "That's why we have to be patient, my lion. You have to get stronger. Your body remembers the path back, even if your mind is trapped. You have to get strong enough to tell them, to tell everyone who was really in the car with Kevin Hayes that night." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was no one else in the car with Kevin Hayes. The police report had been exhaustive. The first responders found him alone, slumped over the steering wheel. She was lying, or she was insane. But then I saw it. The screen was high definition, every pixel sharp and clear. As Maria spoke those last words, a single tear escaped from the corner of Leo's right eye and traced a slow, glistening path down his temple. It was a response, a confirmation. He understood her. He was a prisoner not just in his body, but in a secret I couldn't even begin to fathom. For the next week, I lived a double life. By day, I was the grieving, distant father, the powerful CEO. I made my hollow visits to Leo's room, spoke my empty words, and left. But by night, I became a detective in my own home. I turned my formidable research skills away from corporate acquisitions and onto one woman, Maria Sanchez. The background check I'd run when I hired her had been standard, cursory. It showed a clean record, a string of housekeeping jobs for wealthy families in the tri-state area. Now I dug deeper. I hired a private investigator, a discreet ex-Mossad agent who owed me a significant favor. I wanted everything: her financials, her phone records, her family history, her life story. While I waited, I listened. Every day I locked myself in my office and eavesdropped on their secret sessions. The pattern was always the same. She would start in Spanish, coaxing his finger to move with gentle encouragement, and stories about her childhood in a small village I couldn't find on any map. Then she would switch to English, her voice hardening as she spoke of the accident, of secrets and lies, of a monster who walked free. She never used a name, but she was building a narrative, feeding it to my son, drop by poisonous drop. And with every word, Leo grew stronger. The single finger movement became two. Then his whole hand would clench, weakly at first, then with more force. It was as if her venom was his medicine, her quest for a hidden vengeance, the very thing that was pulling him back from the abyss. I felt trapped, a ghost in my own house, watching a plot unfold that I didn't understand, starring my own son. The investigator's report landed in my encrypted inbox a week later. It was thick, detailed, and utterly shocking. Maria Sanchez was not Maria Sanchez. Her real name was Isabella Rojas, and 20 years ago, her older sister, a young woman named Sofia Rojas, had been the victim of a hit and run. The car that struck and killed her was registered to a shell corporation. The driver was never found, the case went cold, and the powerful family rumored to be connected to the car faced no consequences. My blood ran cold as I read the name of that family. It wasn't mine. It was the family of my former business partner, Marcus Thorne, a man I had destroyed in a hostile takeover just 6 months before the accident that took my wife and son. My mind raced, connecting disparate points of data into a terrifying constellation. Marcus Thorne, a ruthless man with a well-known penchant for reckless behavior, and a son, Julian, who was just as wild. The hit and run 20 years ago. Maria Isabella and her decades-long quest for justice. Her employment in my house, a position that gave her unparalleled access to my life, to my son. But what was the connection? How did it all lead back to the rainy night on the interstate? I scrolled to the last page of the report, to the recent phone records. A series of calls, all placed from a burner phone Isabella had hidden in her room, to a single, unlisted number. My PI had managed to trace it. It was a private line, registered to a secure penthouse apartment in the city. An apartment I knew well. It belonged to the lead detective on Leo's case, the man who had personally assured me that the drunk driver, Kevin Hayes, had acted alone. The final piece of the report was a transcription of a text message, sent from Isabella's phone just 2 days ago. It read, "He is getting stronger. He is starting to remember. Soon he will be able to point to the man who killed his mother." The text message on the screen felt like a death sentence. He will be able to point to the man who killed his mother. The implication was a dagger aimed at my heart. Isabella believed I was the monster. She had infiltrated my home, my life, under the assumption that I had somehow orchestrated the accident, perhaps as a twisted act of revenge against Marcus Thorne, using his son as a pawn. Her sister's cold case had festered into a deep-seated paranoia, a conviction that the wealthy and powerful people like Marcus, people like me, operated by a different set of rules, capable of unspeakable evils. She wasn't just healing Leo, she was forging him into a weapon, a key to unlock the justice she had been denied for 20 years, even if she was aiming it at the wrong man. The detective. The calls to the lead detective on the case, a man named Corrigan, were the fulcrum on which this entire conspiracy pivoted. Was he dirty? Was he feeding her this narrative? Or was she feeding him? I had to get ahead of it. I couldn't barge in and confront her. She would paint me as a cornered animal, a guilty man trying to silence his accuser. I couldn't go to the police, not when one of their own was implicated. I had to create a scenario where the truth had no choice but to reveal itself. My plan was audacious, risky, and hinged entirely on the progress my son had made. That evening I went to Leo's room. It was late, the night nurse had just finished her rounds. I dismissed her for the night, telling her I wanted to sit with my son. For the first time in 2 years, I pulled the stool up to his bed, just as I had seen Isabella do countless times. The room was quiet, filled with the sterile hum of machinery. "Leo," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. "I know you can hear me, and I know you've been working hard. Isabella, she's a remarkable woman." I reached out and took his hand. It felt frail, but there was a warmth to it that hadn't been there before. "Leo, she's wrong about me, but she's right about that night. There was someone else, and I need you to show me. I need you to show everyone." I looked into his eyes, pleading. "Tomorrow I'm going to bring some people here. Detective Corrigan will be one of them. I need you to be ready. Can you do that for me? Can you do that for your mother?" For a long moment there was nothing. Then I felt it, a faint but unmistakable pressure against my palm. He squeezed my hand. The next day, the house was a stage. I called an emergency meeting. I summoned my head of security, my lawyer, and Detective Corrigan, telling him there had been a major breakthrough in Leo's condition that was relevant to the case. I also made one other call, to Marcus Thorne. I told him his name had come up in a security threat against my son, and that his presence was required. He arrived blustering and indignant, flanked by his smirking son, Julian. I gathered them all in the grand living room, which had a direct line of sight to the open doors of Leo's room, where he lay in his bed, the center of our universe. Isabella was there, instructed to stand by Leo's side. Her face was a mask of triumphant anticipation. She thought this was her moment, the culmination of her life's work. She believed I had assembled them all to witness my own downfall. I stood before them, the weight of the last 2 years pressing down on me. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. "As some of you know, my son Leo has been making remarkable progress. Progress he owes to the incredible dedication of Miss Sanchez." I nodded towards Isabella. She gave a curt, self-satisfied nod back. "He has regained some movement in his hands. More importantly, he has regained his memory of the accident." A murmur went through the room. Corrigan shifted uncomfortably. Marcus Thorne paled. "Detective," I said, turning to him, "you assured me Kevin Hayes was alone in the car that night. But Leo remembers someone else. Someone who fled the scene, leaving my wife to die and my son to this fate." I turned my gaze to Isabella. "Miss Sanchez has a theory about who that person is. She believes it was me." Isabella's eyes widened, shocked that I had laid her cards on the table so openly. Before she could speak, I continued, my voice rising. "But I have a different theory." I walked towards Leo's room, the others following like iron filings to a magnet. We stood at the doorway. "Leo," I said gently, "the man who ran away, the man who was in the car with Kevin Hayes, the man who let your mother die, is he in this room?" The silence was absolute. Every eye was on my son. Slowly, painstakingly, Leo lifted his right arm. It trembled with the effort, a testament to the thousands of secret sessions with Isabella. But he lifted it. His hand was clenched in a fist, except for his index finger, which he extended. It was the gesture Isabella had taught him, the one he had practiced for weeks. Her moment of vindication had arrived. His arm moved, sweeping across the room in a shaky arc. It passed over me. It passed over the detective. Isabella held her breath, a victorious gleam in her eye. But the finger didn't stop. It kept moving, past her, past my lawyer, past Marcus Thorne, until it stopped, pointing directly, unequivocally, at his son, Julian Thorne. A collective gasp filled the room. Julian's face turned the color of ash. That's impossible. He's a vegetable," he stammered. "He's not a vegetable," I said, my voice like ice. "He's a witness." Marcus lunged for his son, but my security was faster. Detective Corrigan, seeing his conspiracy crumble and desperate to save his own skin, was already pulling out his cuffs. But the most profound reaction came from Isabella. She stared at Julian, then back at Leo's pointing finger, her face a canvas of utter confusion and dawning horror. For 20 years, Her grief had been a compass pointing north, to a generic, faceless evil embodied by men like Marcus, and eventually by me. She had been so consumed by her narrative that she never considered the truth could be more specific, more banal. It wasn't a powerful man who killed her sister or my wife. It was his weak, cowardly son. Later, the story came out. Julian and Kevin Hayes, drunk and high, had been street racing. Julian, whose father had covered up the hit and run that killed Isabella's sister years ago, knew he couldn't be found at the scene of another accident. He had pulled his unconscious friend into the driver's seat and fled into the night, calling the only person he knew he could trust to clean up his mess, Detective Corrigan. Corrigan, already on Marcus Thorne's payroll, had buried the evidence. Isabella was the last to leave. She stood before me, her face stripped of all its righteous certainty. I was wrong," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I saw another wealthy man, and I saw my sister's ghost. I'm sorry." I looked at her, this woman who had tormented me, who had plotted my downfall, but who had also, through her misguided quest, given me back my son. "You were wrong about me," I said, "but you were right about Leo. You saw the lion inside. You gave him a reason to fight. For that I can never repay you." She left my house that day, a woman unburdened by a decades-old vengeance, free to finally mourn. And I went to my son's room, not as a visitor to a mausoleum, but as a father. I sat on the stool, took his hand, his moving, living hand, and for the first time in 2 long years, we began to talk.